We started with a project funded by the European Commission in 1999, together with universities of Siena and Rome in Italy, Cadiz in Spain, York in the United Kingdom, Aveiro in Portugal, Campinas and Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil, and Universidad del Centro, and Luján, and the University of Salvador in Argentina. This was a huge project that lasted for 3 years, and then we had another funding from the European Commission to continue the research on the Paraguayan wetlands, and finally this project that was carried on together with University of Cadiz, that was leading the project, University of Buenos Aires, our university, University of Siena, and SECOAL, which is the Institute for Ecology from CONICET, the Argentine Council for Research, Scientific Research. This was funded by the foundation of the Bank of Bilbao Vizcaya from Spain. This was a 3-year project. The Iberá wetlands are one of the largest wetlands in South America. They cover a huge region in the Del Plata Basin that includes Pantanal. Pantanal is the largest area. Then you have Iberá in Argentina, here, in Argentina, and here in Paraguay, Pantanal is up here. Here in Paraguay, you have Ipoá and Ñembucú. They are part of the same system. They have originated at the same time, but they have different dynamics. They are not behaving exactly in the same way because of geological reasons, basically. So here in this project, we focused on the Iberá region, and I want to point out, because this is some important part of the work, the shallow lakes that are part of the system. The Paraná River runs here from east to west, and these wetlands are at a higher level than the river. They have a basin that covers, as you can see here, 200 kilometers in this sense, and 130 kilometers in width. And it's basically a very shallow sheet flow system that covers mostly, this half of the system, while here you have sandy sort of fingers, more wave-like surface. I will show here in the system, in the satellite image, you can see this better. Here you have the Paraná River, and here you have the Paraguay River coming from the north. Here is Iberá, this is the basin, the watershed, and here you have Batel-Batelito wetlands, Santa Lucia wetlands, and here you have Ñembucú, and further north is Ipoá. And here you have, these are not exactly wetlands, they're called bañados, they're rivers, but you have lots of water anyway, of Aguapeí and Miriñay that go to the Uruguay River. This is the Uruguay River. So this is a very, yes?
That yellow comes from the satellite?
No, yellow is ours, defining the watershed, the watershed. The slope is very, very soft. You have a difference of 10 meters in 200 kilometers. So it's really a very light slope. So the waters flow very slowly. And here you have some pictures just to give you an idea of what the vegetation is like. This is a very particular characteristic of these wetlands. There aren't any other wetlands that have this. Here you have soil. This is firm soil. And this here is not soil, it's just floating islands, floating vegetation islands. And they have this, they're very thick, they almost touch the bottom of the wetlands. They are so thick that animals live on them, and you can walk on them. So the thicker ones are really very, very robust in a certain way. The particular behavior is that when the waters go up, the islands go up also. So they are never flooded. Or maybe there is a delay, but they're not permanently flooded if the water goes up. They go up also. So here you have more. Here the vegetation is not so dense, so you cannot walk here, but you cannot go with a boat either, a normal boat. This is an aerial view. You can see how the density changes from area to area. Here you have a close-up. And here you have an aerial view where you can observe how clear the water is. It's very, very clear, and this brings some problems when you want to study the area with satellite images. Because if you don't take the right algorithms, the water is not there. For example, if you take a classic NDVI method for searching for vegetation, you will get that everything is vegetation, no water, or very little water, which is not the case, obviously. This is because of the transparency of the water. So here is a sketch of what it looks like. If you look at the transect here at Iberá, a shallow lake, you have the floating vegetation. This is just a few meters, just 8 meters from the border, the high border where the soil is, to the bottom, and you have here the floating vegetation. So this is the particular characteristic of the Iberá wetlands. You cannot find this in other places, which makes them very interesting to study. So this is the western side, where the soil is mixture of clay and sand, and has a very different morphology, where you have these very round, shallow lakes and some streams that drain the water. So looking at this again, the whole system, Ñembucú, Iberá, Batel-Batelito system, you can see these particular morphologies. The first system is the large shallow lakes and eastern steros, and then you have the Iberá Ñembucú, which is populated and it's used for agriculture and cattle raising. And then you have the southern draining network that goes to the Paraná River. The vegetation, this is just to show you the types of vegetation that we can have. You have submerged vegetation, floating vegetation, incipient embalsado, which is the floating island, the robust embalsado with larger species, and what people call bañado, which is the soil that can be inundated at times. It's not always flooded, but it can be flooded at some times. The questions that were brought to us are these. Have the large shallow lakes of the Iberá system changed over 20 years? Those shallow lakes are actually water flowing below the vegetation, and they're delimited by vegetation. So it's not the typical shallow lake, right? What has been the dynamics of the Iberá system over 20 years, and what happens in the Iberá system when the water levels are extreme? So when you have very high water levels, or when you have very low water levels. And the question was, what's going to happen in the next decades? Iberá has a fantastic diversity of birds. It's a refuge for migrating birds. They have some unique mammals and thousands of insects that in the first research project with the European Union, there were some insects that were discovered. They were not known before. So it's a wealth of life forms. What we have to work with water levels that are taken at Laguna Iberá. This is a huge area. It's 14,000 square kilometers, and it's barely accessible. You can access the wetlands from the borders, but not really get inside them. So we had the water levels at Laguna Iberá from an accessible point, and the Landsat images that we use for this work that were provided by the National Space Agency. Water levels, as you can see, they vary a lot. You have more than 1 meter in variation. And for the study, just to compare the wetlands at different periods, we had to consider years in which the water levels were similar at the same dates, so the same month, and precipitation was similar before, so that we wouldn't have any spurious information. So we took 3 dates in which the water levels were more or less the same, and precipitation in the month before was more or less the same. This is a place where it rains a lot.
These are measurement, local measurements?
Yes.
They are measured by,
Yes,
by
yeah.
the provinces?
No, you have the meteorological Servicio Meteorológico measurements from Corrientes, Posadas, and Mercedes. Mercedes is INTA. So we have the triangulation from outside, data from outside the system. Of course, inside the systems, there weren't any stations.
So these are from what station?
The water levels from Iberá, from the local water gauge. But meteorological data we used is from the surrounding stations. So we work with a mosaic of images. One image does not cover the whole area. So here you have 2 images. We didn't work on the southernmost tip, and it was corrected for radiometric and atmospheric corrections. Now, these are the spectral signatures from different types of surfaces that you can find in the steros. You have clear water. This is the way in which the satellite sees the water. In different bands, you have 7 bands on satellite Landsat images. Band 1, 2, and 3 are optical, while band 4, 5, and 7 are infrared, so they are thermal. We have here water, we have turbid water, we have vegetation that it's picked up differently with different frequencies. We have clay soil and muddy soil. These are the 5 basic surfaces that you can detect from the sky. Now, in order to work with this, we linearized because of the values at these particular bands that Landsat use, and we have these as spectral signatures for the points that are covered by the bands. First of all, we need to separate water from vegetation. And there is a method called tassel cap transform that allows to pick up from these 7 band images the brightness, which is usually related to dry surface, the soil, the greenness, which picks up the vegetation, and the wetness that picks up where water is. Now, in order to separate the water, what we do is to compare, to subtract from the wetness image the brightness image, the soil. And we get the difference in another image, pixel by pixel, and we work with that difference. Now, that difference has a histogram, so you have for different pixel values a certain amount of brightness. And you have the amount of pixels at each one of the brightness of the value of the pixel, and you decide where to cut off. This is done by the expert analyzer. You cut off here where you have the lowest value of pixels, and we say, okay, whatever is above this value, it's going to be taken as water. So once you do that, it's called a water mask. You pick up all the water surfaces. Now, using that, we compare the images and see how the water surfaces have changed along these years. And we have here, these three shallow lakes are the ones at the top, the further north ones. And they have an increase in water surface, so their surface has increased, which means that the vegetation was pushed away in a certain sense. Those are hectares that have have increased in water surface. Now, Iberá is more or less at the middle of the esteros, and it has increased in 5%. And these here are the southernmost shallow lakes. Now, Fernandez has increased a lot. It really stands out in the increase, but overall, the water surface only increased in 7%, but it's almost 2,000 hectares of water surface.
So those hectares are thousands? The units are thousands?
No, the units are hectares, but you can see here at the bottom that the total change within the wetlands is almost 2,000 hectares. Now, what happened to the vegetation on the border of the shallow lakes? We use NDVI. This was what I said before, that you have to be careful because it didn't show where the water was. In this case, you see here you have bands 3 and band 4. Band 3 and 4 are the ones in which water and vegetation show the largest differences. So it's really good for this purpose, to check what are the difference between band 4 and 3 compared to the sum of band 4 and 3. That gives us, when you are close to -1, means that you have water. And when you are close to 1, means that you have vegetation. Now, if you picture that,
And 0 is what?
0 is something in between water and vegetation. For example, a pixel that could have 50% water and 50% vegetation.
Suppose that it was just dry forest.
No, it's a different interpretation for dry forest. That's why you cannot use the methodology blindly. You have to interpret at every time step what is happening. So here you have the images that NDVI gives you in 86, 2000, and 2005, and you can see where you have white means that you have more water there. while if you have white, you have more vegetation there, and if you have darker areas, you have more water than before. Okay, so this is very difficult to understand. So what we did was to compose an image, giving each one of these three a color. The basic colors for digital processing are sienna magenta, and cyan magenta, and the yellow. And what you have, if you give each one of those years one of these three colors, is this. Now, what is this saying? These are the pixels that are showing vegetation. Where you have white, here you had no changes. Nothing changed. Everything remained the same. In red means that there was vegetation in '86, but then disappeared. Water was in place of vegetation. If you look at green, green means that you had vegetation only in 2000. If you have blue here, for example, you had vegetation only in 2005. And the others, it means that you had vegetation in '86 and 2000, but not in 2005, and so on. So you can have a better look at what happened, and you see here, all in the border, you can see that there was vegetation in '86, but then it was gone. Same thing for Galarza and Luna and Naranjito. You have here, there is a huge loss of vegetation. And here you have Fernandez. You see all of this is gone, and some things appear here afterwards, and so on. So if we look at the differences between the free water increase and the border vegetation, you see here you have all positive. You have more water, and in vegetation you see that you lost vegetation and the proportion of that loss. So if you look at how much free water increased and how much border vegetation decreased, you have a difference of 81%. So 81% is not 100%, right? So there's something that was lost, and we don't know where it went. This is how much the shallow lakes changed. And here we go very well from north to south, except for Fernandez. And this is an outlier in a certain sense. We don't know what was in Fernandez that made it stand out in this way. So the loss of Embalsados area explains 81%, but which could be the causes of that loss of vegetation? So we looked again at where this was happening. As you can see, it's not even. Here nothing happened. Here there was a huge loss. But basically we can relate this, we had the idea of relating these losses to extreme wind events. So are the waves generated, because this is floating vegetation, it's not a soil border, traditional border. So when you have winds, the waves could be pushing these floating islands or breaking them down. High water levels, several consecutive days of medium to strong wind intensities, a combination of factors. Okay, what we did was take the water levels at Laguna Iberá and the Landsat images and daily winds direction and velocity over those 20 years. Here we have 3 El Niño events, which pushed up the level of the water. The last one was in '98, and then things sort of went down, water went down. Now, extreme by excess are those data that exceed the 90th percentile of a time series. In our case, because of the data series, winds above 50 kilometers per hour are extreme, and water levels above 2 meters 23 at Laguna Iberá. The satellite images for those dates were analyzed, and color compositions were used to determine changes between dates, and the possible causes were analyzed. Now, in the period 86-98, sorry, you have 17 periods of maximal water level that lasted for 18 or more days in 50% of the cases. The most frequent wind velocity was 35 kilometers per hour, and in 50% of the cases. The most frequent wind direction, yeah?
What do you mean in 50% of the cases? Of the 17 periods?
Of the 17 periods, yes. No, this is wind velocity. This is water level.
Yeah.
So 17 times water level was above the extreme value.
For 18 days?
For more than 18 days, right? Now, this is wind.
But what is the 50% there?
In this case, this 50% relates to 17 periods, okay? In here, you count the days in which wind was above at 35 kilometers per hour. All those days, right, 50% of the strong winds, 50% of the days of strong winds were above 35 kilometers, right? The most frequent wind direction was east, and the strongest wind direction was south. So wind blowing from the south, lasting more than 3 days in 35% of the cases. In the next period, 98 to 2000, this was a very particular period. It's a short period, but in these 2 years, you have 5 periods of maximal water level lasting 11 days or more in 50% of the cases. The most frequent wind velocity was 39 kilometers per hour or more in 50% of the cases. Now, the most frequent wind direction was south and east, and only twice strong winds were above 50 kilometers per hour from south and southwest. From 2000 to 2005, you had 13 periods of maximal water level during more than 12 days in 50% of the cases. Most frequent wind velocity was again 35 kilometers. The most frequent wind direction here was north and northwest, and winds above 50 kilometers in 70% of the cases in south direction. After 2005, we didn't get any extreme behavior. Now, what can we see? The winds, I'm sorry, I lost the slide there. The winds do explain the loss of vegetation because of the directions we know where the waves were pushing at that time. So the winds are combined with the high water levels that makes the waves stronger, are responsible for the loss of border vegetation. Now we want to see in a deeper detail how each pixel changed. We want to know if the vegetation increased and where the vegetation increased, or if it decreased, where it did decrease, not just the border of the shallow lakes. So we use spectral mixing, which is a method that helps analyze what's happening in each pixel. It can tell you in each pixel, which is homogeneous, in fact, the information is just numbers, what percentage of that pixel is water and what percentage of the pixel is vegetation. So each spectrum in a spectral database can be modeled as a linear combination of the spectral signatures with coefficients between 1 and 0, so they add up to 1. Each pixel in the image is a point or a vector that has the component in each one of the bands, right? So if you have 7 bands, you can have at most as 7 component vectors in R7. But you can pick up which are the signatures that are giving you the information you need. You don't need to use all 7. You can use from a minimum of 2 to up to all of them. Each constituent of ground cover materials can thus be defined as an end member. You can use it as in a sense as a base vector. And it's clear that the election of the most representative end members is key. So that's where the expert comes and says, look, here you need to use this band and this band because those are the bands that are giving you the most information. Then what you do is that you take the reflectance value of each pixel as a product of a matrix M, which is the matrix which columns are the signatures of the selected end members or base vectors, and F is a vector representing the fraction of each end member in the combination, in the linear combination. If the matrix is not invertible, which is basically almost the case, a pseudo-inverse shall be computed, which is the least squares fitted solution. A vector of percentages can be used for reconstructing the image pixel by pixel and obtaining the reflectance values. The method is quite simple after you think of it. In such a way, the error of the method can be estimated by the quadratic difference of what you have, the difference from what is real and what you have computed. Now, coming back to our problem, spectral unmixing is, in fact, the decomposition of the spectral signatures in each pixel. And here, because of what we had before, if you look at, here. If you look at the spectral signatures of the components of the wetland, the water, the turbid water, vegetation, and soil, and you look just at bands 3 and 4, as we did before for NDVI, you have this component here, which means vegetation, and this one here, water, and they are the ones that are the most separated. They're not orthogonal, but they are almost there. So we use these two as the base. They're adequate for what we want to do, and we will pick up from those two components, using bands 4 and 3, the proportion of water plus the proportion of vegetation that will give not 1, because we're missing something, but it will be almost 1. Okay, so just to show you, these are the two base vectors we're going to use. And here is the water image. Well, water image means that we're going to split this into 5 classes, which will give us 0 vegetation, 25% vegetation, 50% vegetation, 75% vegetation, 100% vegetation. So if you look at those, each pixel, and you look how much water and how much vegetation you have, and you use these 5 classes, you can observe that 55% of the pixels of the whole watershed will give you no changes. They have remained the same. In 27% of the cases, vegetation went from one class to the one above. So there was an increase of 25%. In almost 6% of the cases, you have an increase of 2%. So it is increased in 2 classes. In 1%, 3, in less than 1, and less than in 4 and 5 cases. Now, from vegetation to water, in 8% of the cases, the vegetation decreased very little, more than 1 step. So if you look at the 5 classes.
Excuse me, I'm kind of confused. So in this last slide, it seems that mostly vegetation went Can you put it again?
Yes.
So in this last slide, it seems like mostly water went to vegetation.
Yes.
Yeah.
And on the other, I mean, 5 minutes ago, I was thinking that water was increasing in
Just in the shallow lakes. Only in the free water areas. Because you have basically two sorts of landscapes, if you may call them that way. One is the most homogeneous part of the wetlands, where you have vegetations almost everywhere, and the others are the areas where you have these water bodies that are open, free water bodies. You can navigate on them. So people normally what they do is just go there and look around what's happening there. These water bodies were larger. They increased their surface. But they are not representative of the whole wetland. So this, what we're looking at here is at the whole wetland and see what's going on. If the vegetation is denser everywhere, mostly. Vegetation has increased in the globally in the area. You have more vegetation, but at the same time, the free water bodies have become larger. Yes, it's clear? Yes. Okay, thank you. So here you have the 5 classes. Class 1 is water. Class 2 is 25% vegetation. Here's 50% vegetation, 75% vegetation, and 100% vegetation. That doesn't mean that there isn't water below. It means that it's fully covered. Now, the number of pixels that remain in the same category, in the same class, are for water, 80%. For 25% water, just 4% remain in the same class. It means that those pixels have changed. 50% water remains only 12%. Now 75% vegetation, I'm sorry, almost remain the same. While 100% vegetation also remained in 78% of the cases the same. Now, this is where the increases appear. 2% of the pixels went from water to 25% vegetation. 18% of the pixels went from 25 to 50% vegetation. 50% vegetation in 65% of the cases went to 75. And in 37% of the cases, 75 went to 100. Now, in 56% of the cases, 25 went to 75. And in 19% of the cases, 50% pixels went to 100%. Those that change to less vegetation. You see, it's much less, but they're still there. From 100% to 75, 18%. From 75 to 25, almost 5. From 50 to 25, almost 2. And from 2 to from 25% vegetation to free water, it's 4%. This is what happened to the shallow lakes, to the big free water areas. This is where things happen. So here the red means from 75 to 100. The yellow means from 50 to 75. And these are the decreases from 100 to 75 and from 75 to 50. And these are the ones that were fully vegetated and went back to water, which are basically here in the borders of the shallow lakes, here and here and here. If you put this over the satellite image, you can see how those change and where. And here are the decreases. The decreases are, again, basically around the borders. And here in this area where we didn't have free water, and here. So the areas that change the most for the decrease are far north, in the separation between the sandy clay area and the free water, the sheet flow area, and at the bottom, at the south. So what has been the dynamics? Just to put everything together, 55% of the Iberia system remained unchanged. 35% only shifted one class, either more vegetation or less vegetation. Most of the pixels of the system exhibit an increase in the proportion of vegetation. The largest amount of changes occurred over the period 86-2000 with the 3 El Niño events. The variation in the area of the large shallow lakes are only, relative to the whole system, 0.6%. And those changes were removing vegetation, shifting from class 5 to class 1. Now, what happens in the Iberia system when the water levels are extreme? Again, I look at the water levels, and we find 4 comparable dates. So this is basically a 10-year difference in the dates. A large precipitation and a high water level. This is above the threshold of extreme water level. And precipitation, a low precipitation, and one of the lowest levels ever recorded. So we compare. Sorry?
It's the precipitation in 1 month?
In 1 month, yes.
It's a huge difference for the same month in the same. So it was March or something like that?
March, yes. Yes. It rains almost evenly along the year, except in winter. In winters you have less rain, but it doesn't mean that you don't have rains, just a little bit less. And you have about 1,200 millimeters per year.
1,000?
Yes, 1,200 millimeters per year on the average.
And that's very strange, no? I mean, a difference from 33 to 200, it's huge.
Yes, yeah. But 33 is very dry. Very, very dry for the area. So here we have the water image for 98 and for 2008. And we look at the differences just as we did before. And we have in red an increase in 3 classes. The slope is 3 classes increase in vegetation. In orange is 2 classes increase, and in yellow it's 1 class increase.
Increases from 98 to 2000.
2008, yes.
But you said that it was very dry.
Yes, but you have more. The thing is that it's dry in the sense that the water levels are going down, but you still have water. You still have water. This is what makes this interesting, because things seem really shouldn't be like that, but then if you analyze carefully, it does make sense. But it's not what you expect. And this is a decrease in vegetation, just in 1 class, and it's only around here. But here you have more dry soil than here. Here you have always water. So this is the full change picture. And you can see that also here, this is where the water drains to the Paraná River. This is where you have a drier area. But here you always have water. And also here you have a drier area. So if we put everything we did together, this is basically what we have. First, we took the satellite images in 86, 2000, and 2005 to analyze the whole system. We georeferenced them. We cut out the watershed. We did the atmospheric and radiometric corrections. We performed spectral and mixing on bands 3 and 4+5. We did data extrapolation, and we color-coded the output images with 5 cover classes. On the other hand, we had the topographic charts. We analyzed the field data for the vegetation cover, and we used the spectral signature identification to prepare the maps. Here we had for the water mask. We computed the free water areas for each water body. We analyzed the output images with NDVI methodology. We color-coded the image of changes for each water body. And this is for the shallow lakes, right? And with the water level, with the water level data series and wind data series, we perform a statistical analysis, and with those two together, we analyze the effects of winds and the reason for the water loss. So this is just in one picture, the whole thing. Now, what did the other people in the project do? We worked on the past of the wetlands. They worked on the future of the wetlands. And this is a paper that just came out now, potential effects of climate change on the water level, flora, and macrofauna of a large neotropical wetland. I'm not going to go into the details because it's their methodology and it's harder to explain. Now, they use models for analyzing the possible behavior of the water levels at Laguna Galarza, the one in the north, the northernmost shallow lake, and Laguna Iberá, which is the one with the water gauge, with low emission scenario and also with high emission scenario. Now here for Laguna Galarza, it's really a very dim future. For Laguna Iberá, no. It's basically this. Iberá with low emission scenario and Galarza remain behaving just as they do now, basically. But with a high emission scenario, Iberá will go down, and Galarza could even disappear. That means that the northernmost part of the wetlands will dry up. The water will remain in the south. Here is the satellite image, means that this area is going to suffer the most, while this area will probably remain at a lower level, but with the same characteristics. This is a map, a handmade map in 1891, which shows where the water was in 1991. So it seems that today the wetlands is in fact larger than it was in the 19th century. So this could be a normal behavior or not. You have to explore this a little bit more. Also, what they did was to check for the habitat of the species that are called charismatic species in the area, and they performed flights with the appropriate methodology for animal censuses, and with field data and environmental data, the ones we provided, and analyzing with the models the variables, both climate and environment, and the 25 selected species. they work with models of geographical distribution and abundance. For the marsh deer, this is a deer that lives on the floating islands, working with landscape units, vegetation units, flooding, and green index, they define the most appropriate areas for the marsh deer are those marked in red. For jacare is the alligator in the area. There are two types of jacare, the black jacare, which is jacare in the scientific name, and the jacare overo, which is larger and is really threatened. Analyzing landscape units, elevation, and green index, those are the most appropriate areas for them. Capybaras, well, they're almost everywhere, but these are the most appropriate areas near the shallow lakes, around the shallow lakes, and in close to dry soil.
So you have those lines for all the animals.
Sorry?
You have those sort of lines of where the animal.
The pixels that reflect, yeah.
And they seem, is there anything special about those lines where they are?
Those are pixels. Those are pixels that have the right vegetation and the right structure where those animals have preference, and they choose to stay.
And they seem to be the same for all.
Yes, basically, yes. For ducks, for wading birds and storks. So you see, for each group of species, you have actually different factors that you analyze depending on their habitat. So basically, if you integrate all the information in an ecologic niche model, you see that the western area and the southern area and the area around these large shallow lakes is the most appropriate for these species. Now the problem is that the key areas are without protection, and moreover, that's where the climate change may have the strongest effect. So, to explore the possible response of biota, we did this work, putting together all these different models and the field work. This is sustained by all the field work that was done. Plant species richness at the basin scale was found to be highly resistant to hydrological changes, as the large dimensions of the wetland acts to buffer against the water level variations. However, local diversity decreased significantly with low water levels, leading to the loss of ecosystem resilience to additional stressors. This is from the projection models. The analysis of macrofauna populations suggested that wetland provides refuge in low water periods for the animals with high dispersal ability. On the contrary, the abundance of animals with low dispersal ability, mainly the large mammals, was negatively impacted in low water periods, probably because they are required to search for alternative resources beyond the wetland borders. The synergy between the recurrent climatic fluctuations and additional stressors presents an important challenge to the conservation of neotropical wetlands in the coming decades. Here's the team, international team, and a last view of the wetlands.